Sometimes the most profound discoveries come when we least expect them, hidden in the quiet corners of our everyday lives. At 84, Marlene Thompson thought her days of surprises were long behind her, especially after losing her husband Harold. 2 years ago, she had found her place at Sunrise Manor Assisted Living, where morning tea and afternoon puzzles filled her gentle routine. But one Tuesday morning changed everything. Marlene woke with half her face swollen and painful. Rosa Martinez, the newest nurse, rushed to help, expecting a simple allergic reaction. Instead, she found something extraordinary. Tucked between Marlene's pillow and cheek was a beautiful silver necklace that Marlene had completely forgotten about. She had hidden it in her pillow decades ago, and somehow it had worked its way out. But this wasn't just any piece of jewelry. What secrets would this forgotten treasure reveal about Marlene's past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the gauze curtains of room 237 at Sunrise Manor Assisted Living, casting gentle shadows across the pale yellow walls that Marlene Thompson had grown to know so well. 2 years and 3 months had passed since she first walked through these doors, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and the weight of a grief so profound it had left her hollow inside. Harold's stroke had taken him on a rainy Tuesday in March, and with him went the careful rhythm of 56 years of marriage. Marlene sat in her favorite armchair by the window, the same spot she claimed each morning at precisely 7:15. The leather had worn smooth under her hands, and she found comfort in the familiar routine. Her small hands, marked with age spots and the faint tremor that had developed since Harold's passing, wrapped around her porcelain teacup, a piece from the china set her mother had given her as a wedding gift. It was one of the few treasures she'd been able to bring with her when she'd sold the house on Maple Street. The tea was Earl Grey, always Earl Grey, steeped for exactly 4 minutes. Harold used to tease her about her precision with such small things, but now these rituals anchored her days. Without them, she feared she might simply drift away like morning mist. "Good morning, Mrs. Thompson." The voice belonged to Margaret Hensley, her next-door neighbor, who shuffled past the open doorway each morning at 7:20, walker wheels squeaking slightly on the polished linoleum. Margaret had been a schoolteacher for 43 years, before arthritis forced her retirement, and she still carried herself with the purposeful dignity of someone who had spent decades shaping young minds. "Good morning, Margaret," Marlene replied, offering the gentle smile that had become her default expression, polite, warm enough to avoid concern, but carefully measured to discourage lengthy conversations. She wasn't unfriendly, but she'd learned, and that too much social interaction left her emotionally exhausted. The hallway filled with the quiet sounds of morning, soft footsteps, hushed conversations, the distant clatter of breakfast preparations from the dining hall. Sunrise Manor housed 63 residents, and Marlene had come to know their routines almost as well as her own. There was comfort in the predictability, even if it sometimes felt like living inside a gentle prison. Her room was small, but thoughtfully arranged. The bed, with its crisp white linens and burgundy throw blanket, sat against the far wall beneath a reproduction of Monet's water lilies. Harold had always loved Impressionist paintings, claiming they captured the way light danced in, ways that felt more real than reality itself. A small desk by the window held her daily crossword puzzle, a stack of library books, and a framed photograph of Harold from their honeymoon in 1967. His smile in that picture was the last thing she saw each night, and the first thing that greeted her each morning. The bathroom door stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of the safety rails that had been installed when she moved in. She'd protested at first. She wasn't that old, that fragile. But the rails had proved their worth more than once during those first disorienting months when grief made her unsteady in ways that had nothing to do with age. At 7:25, right on schedule, Rosa Martinez appeared in the doorway, Rosa was the newest addition to the nursing staff, hired just 3 weeks ago to help with the morning medication rounds. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to carry their own weight of sadness, though she tried to hide it behind professional efficiency. "Morning, Mrs. Thompson," Rosa said, consulting the tablet she carried. "How are we feeling today?" "Just fine, dear," Marlene replied, though something in Rosa's manner always made her want to give a more honest answer. There was a quality to the younger woman's attention that felt genuine rather than merely professional, as if she actually wanted to know the truth rather than simply checking boxes on a care plan. Rosa moved through the room with practiced efficiency, checking Marlene's blood pressure and dispensing her morning medications, a small pile of pills that had grown larger each year. Heart medication, something for her joints, a vitamin supplement that Carol, her daughter, insisted was necessary, though Marlene suspected it was more expensive than effective. "Your daughter called yesterday evening," Rosa mentioned as she made notes on her tablet. "She wanted to confirm she'll be visiting on Sunday." Marlene nodded. Carol lived 40 minutes away in the suburbs, married to a kind but busy man named Robert, with 2 teenage children who found visiting their grandmother more obligation than pleasure. The visits were scheduled with the same precision as everything else in Carol's life: second Sunday of each month, 2:30 to 4:30, with occasional adjustments for soccer games or school events. "She's a good daughter," Marlene said, and meant it, though she sometimes wondered if Carol visited out of love or duty, perhaps both. Perhaps it didn't matter as long as she came. Rosa finished her medical checks and moved toward the door, but she paused at the threshold. "Mrs. Thompson, I hope you don't mind me asking, but have you been having trouble sleeping? You look a little tired this morning." The question caught Marlene off guard. Most of the staff asked standard questions: "How are you feeling? Any pain? Any concerns?" But Rosa seemed to actually observe her patients. It was a quality that Marlene appreciated, even as it made her slightly uncomfortable. "Just the usual," Marlene replied. "Some nights are better than others." Rosa nodded with understanding that seemed too deep for her years. "If you ever need to talk, I'm usually here until 7 in the evening. Sometimes it helps to have someone listen." After Rosa left, Marlene returned her attention to the window. The view looked out over a carefully maintained garden where residents sometimes sat on warmer days. A stone path wound between flower beds that the maintenance staff kept pristine, though Marlene rarely ventured outside. She'd once been an avid gardener. Her tomatoes had won the county fair 3 years running. But now the earth seemed too far away, too demanding of energy she no longer possessed. The morning stretched ahead with its familiar patterns. Breakfast would be served at 8:30 in the dining hall, where she'd sit at her usual table near the window with Eleanor Watts and Frank Morrison. Eleanor had been a nurse during the Korean War and told stories with a precision that suggested she'd shared them many times before. Frank had owned a hardware store and still carried himself like a man accustomed to solving problems, though nowadays his problems were limited to remembering names and finding his reading glasses. After breakfast would come the morning activities: chair, exercises led by a cheerful young woman named Jessica, or perhaps a craft project in the community room. Marlene participated dutifully, but without enthusiasm. The activities felt designed for people she didn't recognize in herself, as if aging required her to pretend interest in things that had never mattered to her before. Lunch was at noon, followed by quiet time when many residents napped. Marlene rarely slept during the day. She'd never been able to manage it, even when Harold encouraged afternoon rests, so she usually worked on crossword puzzles or read mysteries from the facility's small library. She favored British authors who wrote about murders in country villages, finding comfort in problems that could be solved with logic and revealed secrets that stayed safely contained within the pages. The afternoons were the hardest part of each day. Time moved differently here, stretching and compressing in ways that left her feeling unmoored. She'd catch herself looking at the clock and finding that only 20 minutes had passed since her last check, or discovering that somehow an entire hour had vanished without her notice. Dinner came at 5:30, followed by evening activities, bingo twice a week, movies on Fridays, live music on Sundays when volunteers came with guitars and voices that reminded everyone of songs from decades past. She attended these events sporadically, more for the sake of appearance than enjoyment. Harold's wedding ring still sat in the small jewelry box on her dresser, along with her engagement ring and the pearl earrings he'd given her for their 25th anniversary. She'd stopped wearing her wedding ring 6 months after his death, not because she'd stopped loving him, but because the weight of it had begun to feel like a chain anchoring her to a person she could no longer be. Sometimes, late at night, when sleep eluded her, Marlene would open the jewelry box and touch these remnants of her former life. They felt like artifacts from someone else's existence, beautiful but disconnected from who she'd become. The woman who had worn those rings, who had planned dinner parties and tended gardens and worried about mortgage payments, seemed as distant as a character in one of her mystery novels. Rosa Martinez finished her morning rounds at 11:30 and retreated to the small break room where the nursing staff gathered between shifts. She poured coffee from the pot that was perpetually brewing and tried to shake off the lingering sadness that seemed to follow her through these halls. 3 weeks into the job, and she was still adjusting to the pace of life at Sunrise Manor. Her previous position had been at City General Hospital, where emergencies came fast and decisions had to be made in seconds. Here, time moved differently, allowing space for conversations and observations that a hospital setting never permitted. She'd noticed things about Mrs. Thompson that weren't in her chart, the way the older woman's eyes seemed to focus on something beyond the present moment, as if she was perpetually waiting for someone who would never arrive. The careful way she arranged her few possessions, as if creating order in small spaces, could somehow control the larger chaos of loss. The fact that she never mentioned grandchildren, though her daughter had teenage kids who rarely visited, Rosa understood something about carrying grief that others couldn't see. She'd been doing it for 2 years now, ever since the accident that had changed everything. Working with elderly patients felt like a form of penance, though she was still figuring out what she was trying to atone for. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the windows when Rosa made her final medication round of the day. Mrs. Thompson was in her usual spot by the window, working on a crossword puzzle with the focused attention of someone grateful for any distraction from her thoughts. "How was your day, Mrs. Thompson?" Rosa asked as she prepared the evening medications. "Peaceful," Marlene replied, which Rosa had learned was her standard answer, whether the day had been good or difficult. As Rosa organized the pills in their small paper cup, she found herself wanting to ask more questions, to understand what lay behind the polite facade that Mrs. Thompson maintained. But professional boundaries existed for good reasons, and she'd already pushed those limits more than she probably should have. "Sleep well," Rosa said as she prepared to leave. "You too, dear," Marlene replied, offering that carefully measured smile. Neither woman could have imagined that by morning, a simple medical emergency would begin unraveling decades of carefully buried secrets, transforming both their lives in ways they never thought possible. Tuesday morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that made the windows at Sunrise Manor fog with condensation. Marlene woke at her usual time, 6:30, but something felt wrong. The left side of her face throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep beneath her cheek. She touched her face gently and gasped. The skin felt tight and swollen, distorting her familiar features into something foreign and alarming. When she struggled to the bathroom mirror, the reflection that greeted her was shocking. Her left cheek had swollen to nearly twice its normal size, stretching the skin until it shone in the harsh fluorescent light. Marlene pressed the call button beside her bed with trembling fingers, her heart racing with the kind of fear that comes when your own body betrays you without warning or explanation. Rosa arrived within minutes, still adjusting her name tag as she hurried through the door. The sight of Marlene's swollen face brought her up short, professional training immediately taking over. "Mrs. Thompson, when did this start?" Rosa asked, moving quickly to examine the affected area with gentle but thorough hands. "I just woke up like this," Marlene said, her words slightly slurred by the swelling. "It hurts something terrible." Rosa's mind raced through possibilities: allergic reaction, infection, perhaps a dental abscess that had worsened overnight. She checked Marlene's temperature and blood pressure, both slightly elevated but not dangerously so. "I'm going to call Dr. Patterson," Rosa said, referring to the physician who made regular rounds at the facility. "In the meantime, let's see if we can figure out what might have caused this." She began a systematic examination, checking for insect bites, signs of allergic reactions, anything that might explain the sudden onset. That's when she noticed something odd about Marlene's pillow. A small, hard lump beneath the fabric near where her head had been resting. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to move your pillow, okay?" Rosa said, lifting the pillow carefully. As she did, something metallic caught the morning light. Wedged between the pillow and the mattress, partially embedded in the fabric through a small tear in the pillowcase, was an ornate silver necklace. The chain was tarnished with age, but the heart-shaped locket at its center still gleamed with intricate engravings. "Oh my," Marlene breathed, staring at the necklace as if she'd seen a ghost. Rosa carefully extracted the jewelry from where it had been pressed against Marlene's cheek all night. "This must have been what caused the swelling," she said. "The pressure and irritation from the metal against your skin." But Marlene wasn't listening to Rosa's medical explanation. She was staring at the necklace with an expression that shifted from confusion to recognition, to something that looked almost like fear. I don't understand," Marlene whispered. "Where did this come from?" Rosa held the necklace up to the light, examining its delicate craftsmanship. The silver was clearly antique, with the kind of detailed engraving work that spoke of skilled artisans from another era. The locket was slightly larger than a quarter, its surface decorated with tiny roses and what appeared to be initials, though they were too worn to read clearly. "You don't recognize it?" Rosa asked, surprised by Marlene's reaction. Marlene reached out with shaking hands to touch the necklace, then pulled back, as if it might burn her. I'm not sure. It looks familiar, but I can't remember." She pressed her hands to her temples, frustrated by the gaps in her memory that had become more frequent in recent years. Rosa sat on the edge of the bed, holding the necklace. "Carefully. Mrs. Thompson, this was definitely in your pillow. There's a small tear in the fabric here, like it's been sewn inside for a long time and finally worked its way out." The implications of this settled over both women. Someone had deliberately hidden this necklace inside Marlene's pillow, and given the condition of both the pillow and the necklace, it had been there for years, possibly decades. "I need to sit down," Marlene said, though she was already sitting. The discovery seemed to have shaken something loose in her mind, fragments of memory that felt important but remained just out of reach. Rosa noticed that the swelling in Marlene's face was already beginning to subside now that the source of irritation had been removed, but the older woman's distress was clearly increasing rather than decreasing. "Would you like me to open the locket?" Rosa asked gently. "Sometimes that might help you remember." Marlene nodded, unable to speak. Rosa found a small clasp on the side of the heart and pressed it carefully. The locket opened with a tiny click that seemed to echo in the quiet room. Inside, pressed behind a piece of glass, was a small black and white photograph of a young man in military uniform. The photograph was faded but clear enough to make out details. A handsome face with kind eyes, dark hair combed back in the style of the 1940s, and the unmistakable bearing of someone in their early 20s. He wore what appeared to be an army uniform with sergeant's stripes, and his smile held the confident charm of youth. Marlene stared at the photograph for a long moment, and Rosa watched as something shifted in her expression. The confusion remained, but it was joined by something else. Recognition, perhaps, or the ghost of recognition. "Do you know who this is?" Rosa asked softly. Marlene's voice broke slightly. He looks familiar, very familiar. But I can't. She pressed her fingers to her forehead again. My memory isn't what it used to be. Rosa studied the photograph more closely. The uniform and style suggested World War II era, which would have been when Mrs. Thompson was a young woman. But she'd been married to Harold for 56 years, which meant this couldn't be her husband. Mrs. Thompson, is it possible this belonged to someone in your family? A brother maybe, or a cousin who served in the war? Marlene shook her head slowly. I was an only child, and I don't remember any cousins in the military. She paused, staring at the photograph, with an intensity that suggested she was trying to reach through decades of accumulated memories. But there's something about his eyes, something that makes me feel... She couldn't finish the sentence, but Rosa saw tears beginning to form. It's okay, Rosa said. These things sometimes come back gradually. The important thing is that we found what was causing your swelling. But even as she spoke, Rosa realized that finding the necklace had opened something far more significant than a medical mystery. The way Marlene was looking at that photograph suggested depths of emotion and memory that had been carefully buried for decades. I'd like to keep this, Marlene said suddenly, reaching for the necklace with hands that had stopped shaking. If that's all right. Of course it's yours, Rosa replied. But Mrs. Thompson, if you start to remember anything about it, anything at all, please let me know. Sometimes talking through memories can help them become clearer. Marlene nodded, cradling the necklace against her chest. Already, Rosa could see the swelling in her face continuing to recede, but the older woman's emotional state seemed more fragile than ever. As Rosa prepared to leave to call Dr. Patterson and report the incident, she found herself wondering about the story behind that photograph. The young soldier's face had been pressed against Mrs. Thompson's cheek all night, as if he'd been trying to remind her of something she'd forgotten. Something told Rosa that this discovery was going to change everything for Marlene Thompson. The only question was whether that change would bring healing or open wounds that had been carefully sealed for far too long. I'll check on you again this afternoon, Rosa promised as she reached the door. Marlene was still staring at the photograph. In the locket, her fingers tracing the outline of the young soldier's face through the glass. Yes, she whispered, though Rosa wasn't sure if she was responding to the promise of a return visit or to some internal conversation with the past. His name was James, Marlene said suddenly, so softly that Rosa almost missed it. Rosa turned back. What did you say? But Marlene was already shaking her head, confusion returning to her features. I'm sorry. I thought I remembered something, but it's gone again. Rosa made a mental note of the name James as she left the room. Whatever story lay behind that necklace and photograph, she had a feeling it was just beginning to unfold. The photograph haunted Marlene's thoughts for the rest of the day. She carried the necklace with her to breakfast, the weight of it in her pocket both comforting and disturbing. Every time she touched the cool metal through the fabric of her dress, fragments of memory seemed to flutter at the edges of her consciousness, like moths around a flame, never quite landing long enough for her to examine them clearly. During the morning activities, she found herself unable to concentrate on Eleanor's stories about her nursing days in Korea. Instead, she kept seeing those kind eyes from the photograph, the confident smile of a young man whose name she thought might be James, but couldn't be certain. The uncertainty was maddening. After lunch, Rosa appeared in her doorway with a gentle knock. How are you feeling, Mrs. Thompson? The swelling seems to be completely gone. Much better physically, Marlene admitted. But I can't stop thinking about that photograph. I know I've seen that face before, but I can't place where or when. Rosa pulled up the extra chair beside Marlene's favorite spot by the window. Would it help to look through some of your personal things? Sometimes seeing other items from the same time period can trigger memories. Marlene considered this. She'd brought very little with her from the house on Maple Street, mostly practical items and a few sentimental pieces that Carol had helped her select. But there might be something that could provide a clue. "There's a small jewelry box on my dresser," she said. "And I have a few photo albums in the bottom drawer." Rosa retrieved both items carefully. The jewelry box was carved wood with brass hinges, clearly old, but well-maintained. When Marlene opened it, the familiar scent of lavender sachets wafted. Out a habit she'd maintained for decades to keep her jewelry fresh. Inside were the rings she no longer wore, some simple earrings, and a brooch that had belonged to her mother. But tucked beneath the velvet lining of one compartment, Rosa spotted something metallic. "What's this?" she asked, carefully lifting out a set of military dog tags. Marlene stared at them in shock. The metal tags were dull with age, suspended from a chain that had clearly been worn for years. The stamped information was still readable. McKenna, James P. 327-89654, B15 Jun 1923. Catholic. James McKenna. Rosa read aloud. "Mrs. Thompson, these dog tags have the same name you mentioned yesterday." Marlene took the tags with trembling hands. The moment she touched them, a wave of emotion washed over her, not quite memory, but something deeper and more visceral. "I remember holding these," she whispered, "but I don't remember how I got them." Rosa opened one of the photo albums, while Marlene examined the dog tags. The album contained mostly pictures from Marlene's marriage to Harold, wedding photos, anniversaries, family gatherings with Carol as a child. But on one page, Rosa noticed an odd gap, where it looked like a photograph had been removed. "Mrs. Thompson, look at this page. Does it seem like a picture is missing here?" Marlene looked where Rosa was pointing. The page had corner tabs that suggested a photograph had once been mounted there, but the space was empty. More intriguingly, someone had carefully cut around where the photo would have been, leaving no trace of what it might have contained. I don't remember removing any pictures from that album," Marlene said, though her voice lacked conviction. They continued searching through her belongings, and in the back of a small address book, Rosa found a folded piece of paper that had been tucked between the pages. She unfolded it carefully to reveal a Western Union telegram dated August 15, 1945. The telegram was brief but significant. "James safe. Stop coming home. Stop wait for me. Stop love always." Marlene read the telegram twice before looking up at Rosa, with confusion and something that might have been fear. "I don't understand. If I received this telegram about James, why don't I remember him? And why was his photograph hidden in my pillow all these years?" Rosa was beginning to piece together a story that she suspected Marlene had deliberately buried. "Mrs. Thompson, is it possible that James was someone important to you before you married Harold? Maybe during the war?" The question seemed to unlock something in Marlene's mind. She closed her eyes and pressed her fingers to her temples, concentrating. "I was 22 when the war ended," she said slowly. "I didn't marry Harold until I was 24. There were 2 years between the war ending and my wedding. What do you remember about those 2 years?" Marlene was quiet for a long time, and Rosa could see her struggling with memories that seemed to resist being recalled. "I remember feeling sad," she finally said, "very sad, and I remember my mother being concerned about me, saying I needed to move forward with my life. She introduced me to Harold at a church social. But you don't remember why you were sad?" "No, Marlene stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening. "Wait, I remember crying when I packed up my bedroom at my parents' house before my wedding. I was putting things in boxes, and I remember feeling like I was betraying someone. But I told myself I was doing the right thing." Rosa waited patiently while Marlene worked through these fragmented memories. "I think I hid things," Marlene continued. "The necklace, the dog tags. I think I hid them because I couldn't bear to get rid of them, but I couldn't keep them visible either. It would have been wrong to keep another man's photograph after I married Harold. The pieces were beginning to form a picture, though many details remained unclear. James McKenna had clearly been significant enough in Marlene's life for her to keep his dog tags and photograph, but something had prevented them from being together. The telegram suggested he'd survived the war and planned to return to her. But somehow that reunion had never happened, or had ended in a way that Marlene had chosen to forget. "Mrs. Thompson, would you like me to see if I can find any information about James McKenna? Military records are sometimes available, and it might help you remember." Marlene looked uncertain. "I'm not sure I want to remember," she admitted. "There must have been a reason I forgot about him. Maybe some memories are buried because they're too painful to live with." Rosa understood that fear. She had her own memories that she kept carefully contained, experiences too difficult to examine directly. But she also knew that buried pain had a way of seeping out in other ways, creating problems that seemed unrelated to their source. "You don't have to decide right now," Rosa said gently. "But Mrs. Thompson, you've been carrying these items with you for decades. Part of you wanted to remember, or you would have thrown them away completely." Marlene nodded slowly, still clutching the dog tags. "I used to have dreams," she said suddenly. "For years after I married Harold, I would dream about someone calling my name, a man's voice, but I could never see his face in the dream. Harold never knew about the dreams. I was too ashamed to tell him. What happened to the dreams? They stopped after Carol was born. I suppose I became too busy with motherhood to dream about the past." Marlene paused, looking out the window at the late afternoon light. "But lately, since Harold died, the dreams have been coming back. Not the same dreams, but similar ones. Someone calling for me, and I can't find them." Rosa felt a chill as she realized that Marlene's subconscious had been trying to remind her about James, long before the necklace worked its way out of the pillow. The dreams, the sadness that seemed to have no specific source, even her choice to keep certain mementos. It all suggested a love story that had been interrupted and never properly resolved. "I think James McKenna was your first love," Rosa said quietly, "and I think something happened that separated you, but you never stopped caring about him." Marlene looked at the photograph in the locket again, and this time her expression held more recognition than confusion. "Yes," she whispered, "I think you're right." That night, Marlene's dreams came with startling clarity. She found herself standing on a train platform in 1945, wearing a blue dress with white flowers that she remembered selecting with great care. The sun was warm on her face, and she could hear the distant whistle of an approaching train. Her heart was racing with anticipation and nervousness as she clutched a letter in her hand, a letter she'd read so many times the creases were beginning to wear through the paper. She woke with tears on her cheeks and the distinct memory of that blue dress, which she hadn't thought about in decades. More importantly, she remembered why she'd been at that train station. When Rosa arrived for the morning medication round, she found Marlene already dressed and sitting by the window with the necklace open in her hands, studying the photograph with intense concentration. "I dreamed about him," Marlene said without preamble. "About James. I was waiting for him at the train station downtown, the old Pennsylvania station that they tore down in the 70s. I was wearing my best dress, and I had a letter from him saying when his train would arrive." Rosa sat down, recognizing that something significant had shifted overnight. "Do you remember what happened? Did he arrive?" Marlene's expression grew troubled. "I remember waiting, standing on that platform for hours, but I can't remember if he ever came." She paused, frustration evident in her voice. "It's like there's a wall in my memory right at the most important part." Rosa had spent part of her evening researching James McKenna through military databases available online. What she'd found was both illuminating and heartbreaking, but she wasn't sure how much to share with Marlene without potentially overwhelming her. "Mrs. Thompson, I did some research last night. Would you like to know what I found?" Marlene nodded, though she looked apprehensive. James McKenna was a sergeant in the 82nd Airborne Division. He served in France and was wounded twice. Once at D-Day and again during the Battle of the Bulge. According to the records, he was awarded a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star for bravery. "That sounds like him," Marlene said softly. "He was always brave. Even as a boy, he was the one who would climb the highest tree or swim across the widest part of the river. Rosa was surprised by this detail. You knew him as a child? Yes. Marlene stopped, blinking in surprise at her own words. Yes, I think we grew up together. His family lived on Oak Street, just 3 blocks from my parents' house. We went to the same school. The memories were coming faster now, as if the dream had broken through whatever barrier had kept them hidden. He was 2 years older than me, and all the girls thought he was the most handsome boy in town. What else do you remember? Marlene closed her eyes, concentrating. He enlisted right after Pearl Harbor, even though he could have gotten a deferment to finish college. I remember the day he told me he was leaving. We were sitting by Miller's Creek, where we used to go to skip stones. She opened her eyes, and Rosa could see tears forming. I was 19, and I thought my heart would break. But you wrote to each other during the war? Every week, sometimes more often. Marlene's voice grew stronger as the memories solidified. I kept every letter he sent me. I had them tied with a ribbon in a shoebox under my bed. And he kept all of mine, too. He told me they were what kept him going through the worst battles. Rosa waited while Marlene worked through these recollections, watching as years of suppressed emotion played across her features. I loved him so. Much, Marlene whispered. More than I knew it was possible to love someone. When he was overseas, I felt like half of myself was missing. What happened when the war ended? The telegram you had suggested he was coming home. Marlene's expression grew pained. I don't remember. There's still something blocking that part, but I know something went wrong because otherwise... She gestured helplessly. Otherwise, I wouldn't have married Harold. Rosa reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder. Mrs. Thompson, I found something else. I'm not sure if you're ready to see it, but it might help you remember. She opened the folder and removed a photocopy of a newspaper clipping from the Millbrook Daily Herald, dated September 3rd, 1945. The headline read, Local War Hero Returns Home, Sergeant James McKenna honored by American Legion. Marlene stared at the clipping, and Rosa watched as recognition dawned in her eyes. He did come home, she said. I remember this article. Mrs. Patterson at the library cut it out and gave it to me because she knew we'd been writing to each other. So you saw him when he returned? Yes, Marlene pressed her hands to her head as if trying to force the memories to surface. We met at the train station. I remember now. He looked different, thinner, older, with shadows in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But when he saw me, he smiled, and for a moment it was like the war had never happened. What happened then? Marlene was quiet for a long time, and Rosa could see her struggling with something painful. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. We spent 3 beautiful days together. We talked about everything that had happened while he was away, made plans for our future. He gave me that necklace on the 2nd day, said it had belonged to his grandmother, and he'd carried it through every battle, thinking about the day he'd give it to me. Rosa waited, sensing that the most difficult part of the memory was still to come. On the 3rd day, he told me something that changed everything. Marlene's voice grew stronger, as if she was finally ready to face whatever she'd been avoiding. He told me that he'd met someone in France, a nurse who'd taken care of him when he was wounded. He said he'd tried to forget about her, that he'd come home intending to marry me as we'd planned, but he couldn't lie to me or to himself. The pieces were falling into place, and Rosa felt her heart breaking for the young woman Marlene had been. He was in love with someone else, Rosa said. Gently? Yes. And he was too honorable to pretend otherwise or to ask me to wait while he figured out his feelings. Marlene wiped away a tear that had escaped. I told him I understood, that I wanted him to be happy, but inside I felt like I was dying. Is that when you hid the necklace and the dog tags? He tried to take the necklace back, said it wouldn't be right for me to keep it, but I couldn't bear to let him go completely. So I told him I'd already put it away, and I let him think I'd given it back. Instead, I sewed it into my pillow that night, along with his dog tags that I'd kept when he tried to return them too. Rosa understood now why Marlene had buried these memories so deeply. The pain of losing her first love to another woman would have been devastating, especially after years of faithful correspondence and shared dreams of a future together. What happened to James after that? I don't know. I made myself stop caring what happened to him. When my mother introduced me to Harold 6 months later, I was ready to build a new life with someone who would never break my heart. Marlene looked at the photograph again. Harold was a good man. He made me happy in a different way, a safer way. But I never told him about James. Do you regret that choice? Marlene considered the question carefully. I had a wonderful marriage with Harold. We were truly happy together, and I loved him deeply. But now, sitting here with James's photograph in my hands, I realize that part of me never let him go. Maybe that's why I kept having those dreams. Rosa reached over and squeezed Marlene's hand. There's no shame in having loved someone deeply, even if it didn't work out. And there's no shame in keeping a part of that love alive, even after you moved on. I feel like I've been carrying a secret for 70 years, Marlene said. And now that it's finally out, I'm not sure what to do with it. The revelation about James had opened a floodgate of memories, but Rosa sensed there was still more hidden beneath the surface. Over the next few days, she found herself spending extra time with Marlene, drawn by a professional curiosity that had become something deeper, a genuine care for this woman who had carried such a profound secret for so many decades. It was during one of these extended visits that Rosa noticed Marlene staring at a small cedar chest that sat on top of her dresser. She'd seen the chest before, but had assumed it contained practical items, extra linens or seasonal clothing. Now, observing Marlene's focused attention on it, she suspected it might hold more pieces of the puzzle. Mrs. Thompson, you keep looking at that chest. Is there something inside it that's been bothering you? Marlene's hands twisted in her lap. I haven't opened it since I moved here 2 years ago. Harold used to call it my hope chest, though I always told him it just contained old things that weren't worth keeping, but weren't worth throwing away either. Would you like to look through it now? Sometimes facing old memories is easier when you have someone with you. After a long moment, Marlene nodded. Rosa carefully lifted the chest from the dresser and placed it on the bed. The wood was beautifully crafted with intricate carvings along the edges that spoke of careful craftsmanship from an earlier era. When Marlene opened the lid, the scent of cedar and lavender sachets filled the room. The chest was carefully organized, with items wrapped in tissue paper and arranged in layers. On top was a christening gown made of delicate white lace, yellowed slightly with age but still beautiful. Marlene's hands froze when she saw the gown. The color drained from her face, and she sat down heavily in her chair. Mrs. Thompson, what is it? I bought this in 1946, Marlene whispered, her voice barely audible. Before I married Harold? Rosa felt a chill of understanding. For a baby? Marlene nodded, tears beginning to flow freely. I was going to have James's baby. That's the real reason everything changed. The weight of this revelation settled over both women. Rosa sat quietly while Marlene gathered the strength to continue, understanding that she was finally approaching the most painful part of her buried memories. I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after James left. I was terrified, but also, Marlene paused, touching the christening gown with trembling fingers. Also secretly happy. I thought it meant we were meant to be together, that this would bring him back to me. Did you tell him? I wrote him a letter. It took me 2 weeks to find the courage to send it. Marlene's voice grew stronger as the memories became clearer. He wrote back immediately. He said he was coming back, that everything had changed, that we would get married right away. Rosa waited, sensing there was more to the story, but when he arrived, it wasn't the joyful reunion I'd imagined. He looked torn apart, guilty and conflicted. He said he would marry me, that he would be a good father and husband, but I could see in his eyes that he was sacrificing his own happiness out of duty. What did you do? Marlene lifted the christening gown from the chest, holding it against her chest like a shield. I told him I'd made a mistake. I lied and said I wasn't pregnant after all, that it had been a false alarm. I said I'd written the letter in a moment of panic and confusion. Rosa's heart ached for the young woman Marlene had been, facing such an impossible choice. But you were still pregnant? Yes. I sent him away, told him to go back to his nurse in France and be happy. I said I'd realized I didn't love him the way I thought I did, that I'd been holding on to a childhood fantasy. Marlene's voice broke. It was the biggest lie I ever told, but I couldn't bear the thought of trapping him in a marriage he didn't want. What happened to the baby? Marlene was quiet for so long that Rosa wondered if she would be able to answer. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, as if she needed to say them quickly before she lost courage. I hid the pregnancy as long as I could. My mother was the first to figure it out. Mothers always know. She was horrified, not just because I was unmarried, but because she'd never even known I had a serious boyfriend. I'd kept James secret from my family because I wanted him all to myself. Rosa could imagine the scandal this would have caused. In a small town in 1946, my parents sent me to stay with my aunt in Chicago for the last few months. I told everyone I was working at a factory to help with the war effort. When the baby was born, Marlene's voice caught. When my son was born, I held him for exactly 1 hour before they took him away. The pain in Marlene's voice was raw and immediate, as if the separation had happened yesterday rather than 70 years ago. The adoption was arranged through Catholic charities. I was told he would go to a good family, people who could give him everything I couldn't. I signed the papers and I never saw him again. Rosa felt tears in her own eyes as she imagined the magnitude of Marlene's loss. Did you ever try to find him? I thought about it every day for years, but I'd made a choice to give him a better life, and I was afraid that trying to find him would only cause him pain. What if he had wonderful parents who never told him he was adopted? What if he was happy and my sudden appearance would destroy that happiness? So you buried that secret too. When I married Harold 8 months later, I was still grieving. Harold knew something had hurt me deeply, but he never pressed for details. He was patient and kind, and gradually I learned to build a life around the hole that James and our son had left in my heart. Rosa looked at the christening gown, understanding now why it had never been used. You kept this all these years. I couldn't bear to throw it away. It was the only thing I had that connected me to my son. I used to take it out sometimes when Harold was at work, just to touch it and imagine what he might have looked like wearing it. Mrs. Thompson, you said. Your son would be 79 years old now, Marlene finished. If he's still alive. I've done the math 1,000 times. Rosa felt the weight of what Marlene had carried alone for so many decades. The grief wasn't just about losing James. It was about the child they'd created together, the family that might have been, the grandson who might be walking around somewhere completely unaware of his origins. Have you ever considered that he might have wondered about you too, that he might have wanted to know his birth mother? Marlene shook her head. It's too late now. Even if I could find him, what would I say? That I gave him away and spent 70 years regretting it? That wouldn't help either of us. But Rosa could see something changing in Marlene's expression, a spark of possibility that hadn't been there before. The walls she'd built around these memories were finally coming down, and with them came not just pain, but also hope. Maybe it's not too late, Rosa said gently. Maybe there are some secrets that deserve to see the light of day. Marlene looked at the photograph of James in the locket, then at the christening gown in her lap. For the first time in 70 years, she allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to know what had become of her son. Sunday afternoon brought Carol Thompson Mitchell's monthly visit, arriving at precisely 2:30, as always. She was a woman of 54 who had inherited her mother's careful attention to routine and her father's practical approach to problem-solving. Rosa happened to be in the hallway when Carol arrived, and she couldn't help noticing how the daughter's brisk efficiency contrasted with her mother's newfound emotional openness. "How has she been?" Carol asked Rosa before entering Marlene's room. "The staff mentioned there was some kind of medical incident this week." Rosa chose her words carefully, aware that she was walking a delicate line between professional discretion and family communication. "The swelling issue resolved completely, but Mrs. Thompson has been remembering some things from her past that seem to be emotionally significant." Carol's expression tightened slightly. "Mother has always been prone to nostalgia, especially since Dad died. I hope she's not dwelling on sad memories. Actually, I think working through these memories might be helping her heal from some old wounds." But Carol was already moving past Rosa toward her mother's room, her body language suggesting she had little patience for psychological theories about elderly grief processing. Rosa lingered in the hallway, close enough to hear voices but far enough to maintain professional boundaries. She told herself she was simply ensuring Mrs. Thompson's well-being, but truthfully, she was curious about how Carol would react to learning about James and the baby. "Hello, Mother. You're looking well?" Carol's voice carried the cheerful tone that adult children often use with aging parents, affectionate but slightly patronizing. "Carol, dear, I'm so glad you're here. I have something important to tell you." Rosa heard the chairs being arranged and imagined Marlene showing Carol the necklace and photograph. There was a long silence, then Carol's voice, sharper than before. "Mother, where did this come from?" Marlene's explanation was gentler than the version she'd shared with Rosa, carefully edited to focus on the rediscovery of an old friendship rather than a passionate love affair. But even this sanitized version seemed to unsettle Carol. "I don't understand why you never mentioned this James person before. You and Dad were married for 56 years. Why are you suddenly fixated on some boy from before you were married?" "He wasn't just some boy, Carol. He was..." "Mother, you're 84 years old. What's the point of digging up ancient history? Dad's only been gone 2 years. Don't you think it's a bit disrespectful to his memory to be mooning over old boyfriends?" Rosa winced at Carol's tone. She understood the daughter's protective instincts, but Carol seemed incapable of recognizing that her mother had lived a full emotional life before becoming a wife and mother. "There's more, Carol. Things I never told you about my life before. Your father." Rosa heard Marlene's voice become stronger, more determined. The courage she'd found in sharing her story with Rosa was carrying over into this more difficult conversation. "I need to show you something else." There was rustling as Marlene presumably retrieved the christening gown from her hope chest. Rosa heard Carol's sharp intake of breath. "Mother, what is this? I bought this for a baby I never got to raise. Your brother." The silence that followed was so complete that Rosa wondered if both women had stopped breathing. When Carol finally spoke, her voice was barely controlled. "What are you talking about? I don't have a brother." "You do, Carol. He was born in 1946, and I gave him up for adoption." Rosa heard a chair scrape against the floor, presumably as Carol stood up abruptly. "This is ridiculous. You're telling me that you had a secret child and never mentioned it? Not once in 54 years. I was protecting everyone. You, your father, the boy himself. I thought it was better if no one ever knew." "Better for who?" "Mother, this is insane. You can't just suddenly decide you have another child after all these years. People don't keep secrets like this." But Rosa knew that people kept exactly these kinds of secrets all the time. Her work in healthcare had shown her how many families carried buried truths, how many individuals held pain that they'd never shared with anyone. "Carol, please sit down. Let me explain why I made the choices I did." "No, I don't want to hear explanations. I want to understand why you're doing this now. Are you having memory problems? Should I be talking to Dr. Patterson about dementia testing?" Rosa felt her protective instincts flare. Carol's reaction was understandable but cruel, dismissing her mother's revealed truth as mental decline rather than genuine disclosure. "My memory is fine, Carol. In fact, it's clearer than it's been in years. I know this is hard for you to accept. It's Impossible for me to accept because it doesn't make sense. You're telling me that my entire understanding of our family history is wrong? That there's some mysterious brother out there who I've never heard of? His name would be David now. David McKenna, most likely, or whatever name his adoptive family gave him. Rosa heard papers rustling and realized that Marlene was showing Carol the adoption paperwork that must have been hidden in Harold's desk. Where did you get these documents? I found them in your father's study after he died. He knew Carol. He'd known all along. This revelation seemed to stagger Carol more than the existence of the brother. Rosa heard her collapse back into her chair. Dad knew, and he never said anything? He loved me enough to let me keep my secrets. He understood that some pain is too deep to share, even with the people we love most. Carol was quiet for several minutes, and Rosa imagined her trying to reconcile this new information with everything she'd believed about her parents' marriage. This is why you've been so sad since Dad died, Carol said finally, her voice softer. It wasn't just grief over losing him. You've been carrying all this guilt and regret for decades. Yes, and now that it's finally out, I don't know what to do with it. Rosa heard Carol moving around the room, probably pacing as she processed this information. Mother, even if this is all true, what's the point of revisiting it now? This David person, if he exists, has his own life. He's probably got grandchildren of his own. Why would you want to disrupt that? I don't want to disrupt anything. I just want to know if he's all right, if he's been happy, if he ever wondered about me. And what if he hates you for giving him away? What if knowing about you makes his life worse instead of better? Rosa could hear the genuine concern in Carol's voice, but also the fear. Learning about this brother meant that Carol was no longer her parents' only child, no longer the sole heir to their legacy and love. I've been thinking about that, Marlene admitted. But Carol, I'm 84 years old. If I'm going to find him, it has to be soon. Not because I want to cause problems, but because some questions deserve answers. What kind of answers? Mother, he was adopted as an infant. He doesn't remember you. You're not his mother in any way that matters. The harshness of this statement made Rosa want to intervene, but she knew she had no right to insert herself into this family conversation. I gave birth to him, Carol. I held him for 1 hour, and I've thought about him every single day for 79 years. That has to count for something. Rosa heard Carol sigh deeply, the sound of someone recognizing a battle she couldn't win. If you're determined to do this, at least let me help you do it properly. I have contacts through Robert's law firm who specialize in adoption searches. But Mother, you have to promise me that if we find him and he doesn't want contact, you'll respect that decision. Of course I would respect his wishes. I just need to know that he's been loved and cared for, that giving him up was the right choice. Rosa felt tears in her eyes as she realized that Marlene had found an ally in her daughter, despite Carol's initial resistance. The family was about to expand in ways none of them could have imagined just a week ago. I need to talk to Robert about this, Carol said, and to think about how we're going to tell the kids they have an uncle they never knew about. Carol, thank you for understanding. I know this changes everything. Yes, it does. But maybe that's not entirely bad. Dad always said you carried sadness that he couldn't heal. Maybe finding this David person will finally give you some peace. Rosa stepped away from the hallway as Carol prepared to leave, her mind already racing with possibilities. The search for David McKenna was about to begin, and she had a feeling it would transform not just Marlene's life, but everyone around her. 3 days after Carol's visit, Rosa found herself staying late at Sunrise Manor again, ostensibly to complete paperwork, but really because she'd become emotionally invested in Marlene's story. She'd been thinking about her own secrets, the grief she carried like a stone in her chest that she'd never shared with anyone at work. She knocked softly on Marlene's door and found the older woman sitting by her window, looking out at the evening sky with an expression that seemed both hopeful and melancholy. Mrs. Thompson, I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to check how you're feeling about Carol's offer to help with the search. Marlene turned from the window, and Rosa was struck by how much younger she looked since beginning to share her buried memories. The weight of decades of secrecy seemed to have lifted from her shoulders. I'm nervous but excited. Carol called this morning to say Robert's colleague thinks they can find David within a few weeks. It's strange to think that after all these years, I might finally know what became of him. Rosa sat down in the chair beside Marlene, and for a moment they both looked out at the garden, where the last light of day was fading behind the trees. Mrs. Thompson, can I ask you something personal? Of course, dear. After everything you've helped me remember, I think we're well beyond formal boundaries. Rosa took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to share would change their relationship forever. You've been so open about your losses, and it's helped me realize that I've been carrying my own secret grief. Marlene turned to face her fully, and Rosa saw the same gentle attention that she herself had been offering for weeks, reflected back at her. 2 years ago, I lost my son. The words came out in a rush, as if Rosa had been holding her breath and finally needed to exhale. He was 7 years old, and he died in a car accident that was my fault. Marlene reached over and took Rosa's hand without saying anything, understanding that some admissions need to be heard before they can be comforted. I was driving him home from soccer practice. It was raining and I was distracted, talking on the phone with my ex-husband about custody arrangements. I ran a red light. Rosa's voice began to shake. The other driver was fine, but Miguel... She stopped, unable to continue for a moment. Oh, my dear girl, Marlene whispered. He was in the back seat, properly buckled in, but the impact, the doctors said he didn't suffer, but I keep thinking about how scared he must have been in those last moments. How he must have wondered why his mother couldn't protect him. Rosa felt tears streaming down her face, the first time she'd cried about Miguel in months. She'd trained herself to keep the grief contained, to function professionally despite the overwhelming guilt that colored every moment of her life. That's why I took this job, she continued. Working in a hospital was too painful after losing him. Every child I saw reminded me of what I'd lost. But here, with elderly patients, I thought I could still help people without constantly confronting my failure as a mother. Marlene was quiet for a long moment, still holding Rosa's hand. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who understood profound loss. Rosa, you didn't fail as a mother. You had an accident, a terrible, tragic accident, but not a failure. I was distracted. If I'd been paying attention, my dear, I've spent 70 years playing that game. If I'd been braver, if I'd told James about the baby sooner, if I'd fought harder to keep my son. But if is a word that can destroy you if you let it. Rosa looked at Marlene through her tears, seeing her with new understanding. Is that why you've been so kind to me? Because you recognize the guilt? I've been kind to you because you have a good heart, and because I could see you were carrying pain that you couldn't share. I know what that weight feels like. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Two women separated by 50 years, but connected by the universal experience of loss and regret. Mrs. Thompson, there's something else I need to tell you about David. Marlene tensed slightly. What is it? Rosa pulled out her phone and showed Marlene a screenshot of a newspaper article she'd found during her research. I've been doing more searching on my own time, trying to help Carol's efforts. I found this. The article was from the Millbrook Daily Herald, dated just 5 years ago. The headline read, "Local veteran James McKenna passes away at 92. Marlene stared at the screen and Rosa watched as the news sank in. He's gone, Marlene whispered. I'm sorry, I know this is hard to hear, but I thought you should know. Rosa scrolled down to show more of the article. But Mrs. Thompson, look at this part. The obituary section mentioned that James had never married and had no children, but it noted that he was survived by his longtime companion, David McKenna of Millbrook, and David's family. Marlene's eyes widened as she processed this information. David? My David? It seems that somehow your son found James. They were in each other's lives for years. Rosa had spent hours piecing together this part of the story from various online sources. From what I can find, David was adopted by the Patterson family here in Millbrook. They owned Patterson's hardware store. But when he turned 18, he started searching for his birth parents. He found James first, probably because James never moved away from town. James stayed here all these years. According to the records, he came back from France in 1947 and never left again. He worked at the lumber mill until he retired, lived in a small house on Pine Street. The article mentions that he was known for his volunteer work with veterans and for his extensive garden. Marlene was crying now, but Rosa couldn't tell if the tears were from joy or sorrow. He came back. After I sent him away, he came back and stayed. Mrs. Thompson, I think he was waiting for you. The obituary mentions that he never married the French nurse or anyone else. I think he hoped you might change your mind someday. The weight of this revelation was staggering. James had spent decades in the same town where Marlene had grown up, where their son had been raised by another family. He'd found David and maintained a relationship with him, becoming the grandfather to David's children that he might have been under different circumstances. All these years, while I was building a life with Harold in the next county, James was here with our son. Rosa had one more piece of information to share, the detail that had kept her awake the previous night. Mrs. Thompson, there's something else. According to the property records, James left his house to David, but David already owns his own home with his wife. The house on Pine Street is currently empty. What are you saying? I'm saying that your son inherited James's house, which means he has James's belongings, his personal papers, probably letters and photographs that might include references to you. The implications of this settled over both women. David McKenna wasn't just Marlene's son. He was also the keeper of James's memory, the person who might know more about their love story than anyone else alive. He might have the letters I wrote to James during the war, Marlene said quietly, and James might have told him about you, about the real reason you separated. Rosa could see the hope and fear warring in Marlene's expression. The possibility of reunion with her son was no longer just about satisfying curiosity or easing regret. It was about completing a story that had been left unfinished for 7 decades. What if James told him that I abandoned them both? What if David hates me for giving him up and then driving James away? Or what if James told him the truth, that you sacrificed your own happiness to give them both a chance at better lives? Mrs. Thompson, you won't know until you find him. Rosa stood up, feeling lighter than she had in 2 years. Sharing her story about Miguel hadn't taken away the pain, but it had made the burden manageable in a way it hadn't been before. I want to help you find David, not just as your nurse, but as your friend. We've both been carrying secrets that were too heavy to bear alone. Maybe it's time we both learned that some risks are worth taking. Marlene looked at James's photograph in the locket, then at Rosa with renewed determination. Yes, it's time to find my son. Neither woman could have imagined that David McKenna had been looking for his birth mother for over 30 years, or that their reunion would happen much sooner than either of them dared to hope. The next morning brought unexpected news that changed everything. Carol called Marlene at 8 o'clock, her voice tight with controlled excitement. Mother, Robert's colleague found David McKenna. He's been living in Millbrook his entire life, just 20 minutes from here. But Mother, there's something you need to know before we contact him. Marlene's heart was racing so fast she had to sit down. What is it? He's been looking for you. According to the adoption agency records, he started searching for his birth mother 30 years ago, right after his adoptive parents died. He's never stopped. Rosa, who had arrived early for her shift and was present during the call, watched. Marlene's face transformed with wonder and disbelief. "He's been looking for me," Marlene repeated. "The lawyer says David has been working with search organizations, genealogy websites, even hired a private investigator a few years back. Mother, he wants to find you as much as you want to find him." After the call ended, Marlene sat in stunned silence. The fear that had been gnawing at her, that contacting David would be an unwelcome intrusion into his life, had been replaced by the astonishing realization that her son had been seeking her out for decades. "Mrs. Thompson, how are you feeling about this news?" Rosa asked gently. "Overwhelmed, grateful, terrified?" Marlene laughed shakily. 79 years old, and I feel like a nervous young girl about to meet her first beau." Rosa spent the morning helping Marlene prepare emotionally for what was to come. Carol had arranged for David to visit the following day, giving everyone time to process the enormity of what was about to happen. "What if he's disappointed in me?" Marlene worried aloud. "What if I'm not what he hoped his birth mother would be? Mrs. Thompson, he spent 30 years looking for you. I don't think he's going to be disappointed by finally finding you." That afternoon, Rosa made an unprecedented decision. She asked for permission to accompany Marlene to James's house on Pine Street. Carol had contacted David, and he'd agreed to meet them there, saying he had something important to show Marlene before they talked. "I know this is beyond my professional duties," Rosa explained to Marlene, "but you've become important to me, and I want to be there to support you if you need me." Marlene squeezed Rosa's hand gratefully. "I can't imagine going through this without you, dear. You've become like a daughter to me." The drive to Pine Street took 15 minutes through the familiar neighborhoods of Millbrook. Rosa had borrowed her supervisor's car, and Marlene sat in the passenger seat, clutching the silver necklace, her lifeline to the past that was about to become a bridge to the future. James's house was a modest craftsman bungalow with a wraparound porch and a garden that even in late autumn showed evidence of decades of careful tending. The lawn was neatly maintained, and Rosa realized that David must have been caring for the property since James's death. They sat in the car for a moment, both women gathering courage for what lay ahead. "Mrs. Thompson, whatever happens in there, you should know that James loved you enough to stay in this town for 70 years. That has to count for something." Marlene nodded, taking a deep breath. "I keep thinking about that hour I held my baby before they took him away. I memorized his face, his tiny hands, the way he looked at me like he knew exactly who I was. I wonder if I'll see any of that baby in the man he's become." A silver Honda pulled up behind them, and Rosa felt her pulse quicken. Through the rearview mirror, she could see a tall man with gray hair getting out of the driver's seat. Even from a distance, there was something about his posture and the way he moved that reminded her of the young soldier in the Lockett photograph. "Mrs. Thompson, I think that's him." Marlene turned to look, and Rosa heard her sharp intake of breath. David McKenna was clearly James's son. He had the same strong jawline and kind eyes, though his face was weathered by 7 decades of living. He was well dressed in a simple sweater and slacks, and he carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had lived a good life. He approached their car with obvious nervousness, and Rosa could see his hands trembling slightly. When he reached Marlene's window, he stopped and simply looked at her for a long moment. The recognition was instant and profound. Mother and son seeing themselves reflected in each other's faces after 79 years apart. Marlene opened the car door with Rosa's help and stood facing the son she'd given birth to in 1946. David was tall, probably 6 feet, and he had to look down at his diminutive birth mother. But there was nothing patronizing in his expression, only wonder and a deep, abiding gentleness. "Mrs. Thompson." His voice was soft, careful, as if he was afraid she might disappear if he spoke too loudly. "Yes, and you're David." They stood looking at each other for what felt like an eternity, both afraid to make the first move. Finally, David smiled, a smile that was pure James McKenna. and opened his arms tentatively. "I've been looking for you for so long," he said simply. Marlene stepped into her son's embrace, and Rosa felt tears streaming down her own face as she watched 79 years of separation end in a moment of perfect recognition and love. When they finally separated, David wiped his eyes unselfconsciously. "I'm sorry. I promised myself I wouldn't cry, but—" "Don't apologize," Marlene said, reaching up to touch his face gently. "I've been crying about you for 79 years. I think we've earned the right to a few tears." David led them up the porch steps to James's front door, and Rosa noticed how carefully he guided Marlene, making sure she felt steady on the wooden steps. "Before we go inside, I need to tell you something," David said, his hand on the door handle. "James told me about you, everything. He made me promise that if I ever found you, I would give you this first." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a leather journal, clearly old but well preserved. The cover was worn smooth from decades of handling. "What is it?" Marlene asked. "James kept a journal from the day he returned from France until the day he died. Most of it is about you, about loving you, losing you, and hoping someday you'd come back to him. He wanted you to know that he never stopped thinking about you, and that he understood why you made the choices you did." Marlene took the journal with reverent hands, and Rosa could see her struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what David was telling her. "He knew? He knew why I sent him away?" David nodded. "He figured it out eventually, when he found me 18. Years ago I told him my birth date, and he did the math. He realized you must have been pregnant when you told him you weren't. He said it was the most loving and selfless thing anyone had ever done for him. But I lied to him. I drove him away. You set him free to make his own choice without the burden of obligation. He said that was the difference between love and possession. You loved him enough to let him go." Rosa watched Marlene absorb this revelation, seeing decades of guilt and regret beginning to transform into something approaching peace. "Did he ever forgive me?" Marlene asked quietly. "There was nothing to forgive. He spent 70 years loving you and being grateful for the gift you gave him, the chance to choose his own path, and the privilege of knowing his son." David opened the front door, and they stepped into James's house. The interior was neat and comfortable, clearly the home of someone who had lived alone, but had never stopped hoping for company. The walls were covered with photographs, pictures of David at various ages, his wedding photos, pictures of his children and grandchildren. But on the mantelpiece, in a place of honor, was a framed photograph that made Marlene gasp. It was the missing picture from her photo album, a picture of her and James together, probably taken just before he left for the war. She was wearing a white dress and laughing at something he had whispered in her ear, and he was looking at her with an expression of absolute adoration. "He had that photograph enlarged and framed 20 years ago, David explained. "He said it was his favorite picture of the two of you because it captured how happy you made each other." Rosa realized that James had somehow gotten that photograph before Marlene removed it from her album, or perhaps Marlene had given it to him before the war and forgotten about it in her efforts to bury the memories. "There's more," David said, gesturing toward a bookshelf that held dozens of leather-bound volumes. "Every letter you wrote to him during the war. He kept them all, and he read them every year on your birthday." Marlene sank into James's favorite chair, overwhelmed by the evidence of a love that had endured decades of separation. She opened the journal to the first page and read aloud, "Today, I let the woman I love walk out of my life because I was too young and foolish to fight for what mattered most. I will spend the rest of my days trying to become worthy of the love she showed me." Rosa felt her heart breaking and healing simultaneously as she watched this reunion unfold. David pulled up a chair beside his birth mother and began to tell her about the life James had lived, the stories he'd shared, and the love he'd carried for her until his final breath. As the afternoon light began to fade, Rosa realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not just the reunion of a mother and son, but the completion of a love story that had been 70 years in the making. The next morning, David arrived at Sunrise Manor with his wife Linda and their 17-year-old daughter Emma. Rosa had arranged to be present during visiting hours, both to provide professional support and because she'd become emotionally invested in this reunion that had taken decades to unfold. Marlene had spent the previous evening reading James's journal, discovering love letters he'd never sent and dreams he'd never stopped nurturing. She looked exhausted but peaceful, as if a weight she'd carried for 79 years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. "Are you ready for this?" Rosa asked as they waited in the community room, which offered more space and privacy than Marlene's small bedroom. "I don't think anyone can be ready for meeting their family for the first time at 84 years old," Marlene replied with a nervous smile, "but I'm grateful for the chance." When David entered with his family, Rosa was struck by how much love was evident in their body language. Linda McKenna was a woman in her early 70s, with silver hair and warm brown eyes, and she moved with the careful attention of someone accustomed to caring for others. Emma was tall like her grandfather David, with dark hair and the kind of bright, curious expression that suggested she found the world endlessly fascinating. "Marlene," David said, and Rosa noticed he'd chosen to use her first name rather than any maternal title, respecting the complexity of their relationship. "I'd like you to meet my wife Linda and our daughter Emma." Linda stepped forward with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Thompson, David has told us so much about you and about James. I feel like I've been waiting to meet you for years." Emma hung back slightly, clearly uncertain about the protocol for meeting a grandmother she'd never known existed. Rosa remembered being 17 and feeling awkward in emotional family situations, unsure whether her presence was welcome or intrusive. "Emma," Marlene said gently, "would you like to see something that belonged to your great-grandfather James?" The teenager's eyes lit up with curiosity, and she approached Marlene's chair. Marlene opened the silver locket and showed Emma the photograph of James in his army uniform. "He was so handsome," Emma said softly. "He looks like Grandpa David did in his wedding photos." "Yes, he does," Marlene agreed, studying David's face. "I can see so much of James in your grandfather, and now I see it in you, too. You have his eyes, kind and intelligent." Rosa watched this multi-generational recognition unfold, understanding that she was witnessing the restoration of a family line that had been broken for nearly 8 decades. David reached into a canvas bag he'd brought and pulled out a small photo album. "Marlene, I brought pictures of my life. I thought you might like to see them." They spent the next hour going through photographs that documented David's childhood with his adoptive parents, the Pattersons, his school years, his military service. In Vietnam, his wedding to Linda, and the births of his 3 children. Emma was the youngest, born when David was in his late 40s. "The Pattersons were wonderful parents," David assured Marlene. "They told me I was adopted from the beginning, and they always spoke about it as a loving choice that my birth mother made. They said she must have loved me very much to make sure I went to a family who could give me everything I needed." Rosa saw tears in Marlene's eyes as she absorbed this confirmation that her sacrifice had achieved its intended purpose. "They never made me feel like I was missing anything," David continued. "But as I got older, I became curious about you and about my birth father. When I turned 18, they supported my decision to search." "How did you find James?" Marlene asked. "It took years, but eventually I learned that McKenna was my birth father's surname. James was the right age and had never married, so I took a chance and approached him. When I told him my birth date and that my birth mother's first name was Marlene, he sat down on his porch steps and started crying." Emma leaned forward with teenage directness. "Great-Grandpa James showed me pictures of you when I was little. He said you were the most beautiful woman in the world, and that someday, if we were very lucky, we might get to meet you." Rosa felt her heart swell with emotion as she watched 4 generations of a family finally coming together. "Emma," Marlene said, reaching for the teenager's hand, "would you like to have this necklace someday? It should stay in the family, and you're the next generation to carry James's legacy forward." Emma's eyes widened. "Really? You'd give me something that precious?" "It's not a gift. It's returning to where it belongs. You're James's great-granddaughter and my great-granddaughter. This necklace connects all of us." Rosa realized that the necklace, which had caused Marlene's facial swelling and started this entire journey, was completing its purpose. Not just reuniting a mother and son, but establishing Emma as the bridge to the future. Linda had been quietly observing the interactions, and now she spoke with the practical wisdom of someone who'd raised 3 children and understood family dynamics. "Marlene, I want you to know that you're not disrupting our family, you're completing it. David has wondered about you his entire adult life, and now that he's found you, I can see a peace in him that wasn't there before." As Rosa watched this family embrace their expanded identity, she realized that some stories don't end. They simply find new chapters to begin. As the afternoon progressed, Carol arrived with her husband Robert and their 2 teenage children, making the community room at Sunrise Manor feel like the site of an impromptu family reunion. Rosa had never seen anything quite like it. 3 generations of one family meeting, 3 generations of another, all connected by secrets that had been buried for decades. Carol's initial stiffness melted away when she saw how genuinely happy her mother looked. David greeted his half-sister with the careful warmth of someone who understood that family relationships couldn't be forced, only allowed to develop naturally. "I brought something for you," Carol told Marlene, pulling out a manila envelope. "I went through Dad's papers more carefully after our conversation last week, and I found this." Inside the envelope was a letter in Harold's handwriting, dated just 6 months before his death. The envelope was addressed to Marlene, but it had never been opened. "I think Dad wrote this when he realized he wasn't going to recover from his first stroke," Carol explained. "It was in his desk drawer with instructions to give it to you after he was gone, but somehow it got mixed in with his other papers, and I missed it." Marlene's hands shook as she opened the letter that her husband had written as a final communication. Rosa moved closer, ready to provide support if the contents proved overwhelming. "My dearest Marlene," she read aloud, her voice steady despite her tears. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're probably feeling lost without me. But I need you to know that our 56 years together were the happiest of my life, not despite your secrets, but because of the strength and love that keeping those secrets required." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed Harold's words. "From beyond the grave. I knew about James from the beginning. I saw the way you looked sometimes when you thought no one was watching, the sadness you carried that had nothing to do with our life together. I knew about the baby, too. I found the christening gown when we moved the furniture into our first house. I never said anything because I could see that you needed to keep some parts of your heart private, and I loved you enough to let you have that privacy." Rosa felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to this declaration of unconditional love. "But now that I'm gone, Marlene, I want you to know that you have my blessing to find them if you can. Find James, find your son, find the peace that I could never give you because it wasn't mine to give. You gave me a wonderful life, and now I want you to reclaim the parts of yourself that you sacrificed for our happiness." David was openly crying now, and Rosa saw Linda reach over to squeeze his hand. Even Emma seemed to understand the magnitude of what they were hearing. "You are the best woman I have ever known, and if James McKenna was half the man you believed him to be, then he spent 70 years regretting that he let you slip away. Don't let my death become another reason to keep yourself hidden. You deserve to be whole, my darling, and you deserve to know that the love you gave away so long ago was worthy of keeping." The letter was signed simply, "Your devoted husband, Harold," but the impact of his words resonated through the room like a benediction. "He knew all along," Marlene whispered. "He knew, and he loved me anyway." David leaned forward in his chair. "Marlene, Harold sounds like he was an extraordinary man. James would have respected him greatly." They were both extraordinary, Marlene replied. I was blessed to love two remarkable men in my lifetime, even if I couldn't have them both. Emma, who had been quietly absorbing this adult conversation about love and loss, suddenly spoke up with the directness that only teenagers possess. Grandma Marlene, can I ask you something? Rosa noticed that Emma had naturally moved from Mrs. Thompson to the family designation, claiming her place in the expanded family structure. Of course, dear. Do you think Great-Grandpa James would be happy that we found you? Marlene looked at Emma with such tenderness that Rosa felt her heart might break from the beauty of it. I think James would be overjoyed that his great-granddaughter is such a thoughtful, loving young woman, and I think he'd be proud that his son David turned out to be the kind of man who spent 30 years looking for his birth mother. Are you going to come to family dinners now? Emma asked with the practical curiosity of youth. Mum makes really good lasagna on Sundays. The laughter that rippled through the room was warm and genuine. The kind of laughter that happens when people realize they're going to be all right. I would love to come to Sunday dinner, Marlene said, if you're sure there's room for one more at your table. There's always room, Linda said firmly. Family makes room. Rosa realized that she was witnessing the completion of something that had begun with a medical emergency and a hidden necklace, but had become about much more than reuniting lost family members. She was watching the healing of wounds that had been festering for decades, the restoration of connections that should never have been broken, and the creation of new bonds that would last for generations. As the family began making plans for future visits and shared meals, Rosa quietly slipped toward the door, understanding that her role in this story was transitioning from active participant to caring observer. But Marlene's voice stopped her. Rosa, where are you going? You're part of this family now too. 3 months later, Marlene Thompson sat in her favorite chair by the window at Sunrise Manor, but everything about her morning routine had changed. The loneliness that had defined her days since Harold's death had been replaced by a sense of anticipation that made each sunrise feel like a gift rather than simply another day to endure. Rosa knocked on her door at 7:15, as she had every morning for the past 5 months, but now she carried 2 cups of Earl Grey tea instead of one. Good morning, Grandma Marlene, she said, using the title that Emma had insisted Rosa adopt after learning about her own loss. Are you ready for another busy day? Marlene smiled, accepting the tea with hands that no longer trembled with age and isolation. I still can't believe how full my calendar has become. At 84, I thought my social life was behind me. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. David visited twice a week, often bringing Linda and Emma. Carol had adjusted her monthly visits to twice weekly as well, and the awkwardness between the half-siblings had evolved into genuine affection as they discovered they shared their mothers' love of crossword puzzles and their father's practical approach to problem-solving. Sunday dinners at David and Linda's house had become the cornerstone of Marlene's week. She'd started contributing her famous apple pie to the meals, a recipe that Emma was learning to make under her great-grandmother's patient instruction. The kitchen conversations that occurred during these baking sessions had become treasured bonding time for both of them. Mrs. Patterson called yesterday, Rosa mentioned, settling into the chair beside Marlene's. She wants to schedule another interview for the family history project. Margaret Patterson, the retired schoolteacher who lived next door, had started a project to document the life stories of Sunrise Manor residents after hearing about Marlene's remarkable reunion. What had begun as one woman's curiosity had evolved into a community-wide effort to preserve the histories of people whose stories might otherwise be lost. I never imagined that talking about my past would inspire other people to share their secrets, Marlene mused. Eleanor finally told her children about the marriage proposal she turned down in Korea, and Frank admitted that he'd been writing poetry for 60 years, but never showed it to anyone. Rosa had watched this ripple effect with amazement. Marlene's courage in facing her buried past had given other residents permission to explore their own hidden chapters. The assisted living facility had become a place where people felt safe, to be fully themselves, including the parts of themselves they'd kept hidden for decades. Speaking of sharing stories, Emma finished her family tree project, Rosa said, pulling out her phone to show Marlene a photo of the assignment. The poster board displayed 4 generations of the McKenna family, with James and Marlene at the top as the original couple whose love had created this extensive family network. Emma had included photographs, including the wedding picture of Marlene and Harold that Carol had provided, showing how the family had branched and grown over the decades. She got an A+, Rosa reported, and her teacher asked if she could display it in the school's main hallway as an example of how families come in many different forms. Marlene traced James's face in the photograph with her finger, marveling at how different her relationship with his memory had become. The guilt and regret that had poisoned her thoughts of him for 70 years had been replaced by gratitude for the love they'd shared and pride in the son they'd created together. "I dream about him differently now," she told Rosa, instead of dreams where he's calling for me and I can't find him. I dream about conversations where we're both older and wiser. He tells me about watching David grow up, and I tell him about my life with Harold and Carol. It's like we finally have the closure we never got when we were young. Rosa understood something about transformative dreams, since sharing her story about Miguel with Marlene. Her own nightmares about the accident had gradually been replaced by dreams where her son was happy and safe, playing in sunny places where car accidents and guilt couldn't reach him. "Mrs. Thompson," Rosa began, then caught herself. "Marlene, I need to tell you something. I've been accepted to the graduate program in counseling psychology at the State University. I start classes in the fall." Marlene's face lit up with pride and excitement. "Rosa, that's wonderful. You have such a gift for helping people heal from old wounds. You'll be an excellent counselor. I wouldn't have had the courage to apply if you hadn't shown me what it looks like to face buried pain instead of running from it. Watching your journey has inspired me to believe that healing is possible, even from the deepest losses." They sat in comfortable silence. 2 women who had found in each other the courage to reclaim parts of themselves they'd thought were lost forever. "There's something else," Rosa said. "David asked me to give you this." She handed Marlene an envelope, with her name written in David's careful script. Inside was a photograph that took Marlene's breath away, a professional family portrait taken the previous week, showing 4 generations of McKenna descendants gathered around Marlene as the family matriarch. David's note was simple: "For the woman who gave our family its beginning and who came back to help us understand our story, with love and gratitude from all of us." At the bottom of the photograph, in Emma's teenage handwriting, was an inscription: "Great-Grandma Marlene, thank you for keeping the necklace safe until it could come home to us. Thank you for being brave enough to remember. Love always, your great-granddaughter Emma." Rosa watched Marlene study the faces in the photograph. David with his quiet strength, Linda with her welcoming warmth, Emma with her bright future ahead. Of her, Carol and Robert with their teenagers, who were learning to embrace this expanded family story. "You know what the most amazing thing is?" Marlene said finally. "I spent 70 years thinking that the choices I made destroyed everything beautiful about my relationship with James. But those choices, giving up our son, sending James away, building a new life with Harold, they weren't endings. They were just different beginnings." Outside the window, spring was returning to the garden at Sunrise Manor. The maintenance staff was preparing flower beds for planting, and residents were beginning to venture outdoors for the first time since winter's end. "I think I'd like to plant tomatoes this year," Marlene said suddenly. "Emma mentioned that she's never grown anything from seed before, and I'd like to teach her." Rosa smiled, recognizing the significance of this declaration. For the first time since Harold's death, Marlene was planning for a future that extended beyond mere survival. She was anticipating growth, harvest, and the pleasure of sharing knowledge with someone who would carry it forward. As the morning sun filled the room with golden light, Rosa realized that sometimes the most profound discoveries really do come when we least expect them, hidden in the quiet corners of our everyday lives. A forgotten necklace had unraveled decades of carefully buried secrets, but more importantly, it had revealed that love never truly dies. It simply waits patiently for the right moment to bloom again. The silver heart necklace now hung around Emma's neck, connecting past and future in an unbroken chain of love that would continue long after the women who'd hidden and found it had become memories themselves. Some stories, Rosa understood, don't end. They simply find new voices to tell them.